Just a little, I think, word on the structure for tonight. I think we'll open up, we'll have a short lecture, I suppose. We'll be breaking up into small groups to discuss some stuff, and then bring it back together to discuss things as the Lord. So before we start, why don't we pray together? Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this space to be able to meet. Thank you for our brothers and sisters here. Some we may know well, some we may not know too well. But we're grateful we can gather together as brothers and sisters and to discuss this important topic of race. We pray for your spirit of grace and peace upon us. Help us to be open to one another. Help us to receive from our brother Jon, who has done a lot of thought and work in this area. And our hope is, God, that as we struggle to talk about an issue that is so divisive, we pray your spirit of unity would bring us together and help us. This time would be a time we need to grow in our discipleship to you, and how you're bringing healing in this area. So we offer this space and time to you and ask that your Spirit would do a good work among us. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. So just to introduce Jon, I've known Jon, I don't even know, 15 years?
Maybe closer at this point. 20. That just says we're
But some of you, I think, know Jon. For me, I think one of the people I've learned the most from. I think a lot of things as a church, the things we're doing, I've learned from what Jon has taught me in our discussions together. I probably honestly say he's one of the smartest people I know, but he's also, I think, he's like an academic, but he's not like kind of too academic, I guess. I don't know if you read his paper though. He said that paper was written at a 6th grade level, he thought, so a lot of people I heard didn't quite understand his paper. So. But no, I think Jon has a really great sense of where, people are at, and is able to speak to those areas. I guess without further ado, we give it over to you, Jon, if you want to talk to us about some stuff.
I'm grateful to be with you guys and to continue to walk alongside Christ's Kaleidoscope and watch it grow, both in terms of numbers but also in maturity over the years. So, as I understand this time, it's really a time for your community to think more deeply and specifically about a particular issue that is important to you as a church, especially as you think about being something like God's visible presence in the world. And so this will be a time to think about world in the context of, what are we trying to do in this world, and what does this world then look like, or what would it mean to do those things in this world. So I'm going to talk a bit about race. The idea is really to have a conversation as a church, so I'm going to say just a little bit, and then we'll have time for you guys to think about and talk together in small groups and raise some questions, and we'll come back as a larger group and talk about it. So it really is meant to be a conversation together. Just a little background, I don't work in the area of race. I work most in the area of philosophical theology, and so I do a lot of philosophy and political theory. I get asked to do stuff on race probably because I'm not a whitey, and the world of academia and the world of academic theology is chock full of white guys. And so they want non-white guys, so I am invited into speaking into this area. And then secondly, I think I write on and think about race just simply as a matter of survival, to make sense of my own life in a place that's predominantly, or I should say overwhelmingly, not Asian. That's Central Texas. I live in a community with hundreds of students that are, mostly wealthy white kids, so who don't think very much about race either. So I'm aware of my ethnicity all the time. And I go to I work at a university where the university is not particularly adept in thinking through issues of diversity. I don't think any universities quite cracked that nut, but Baylor, I would say, is still making its way. So I kind of find myself thinking about race both for my own survival and then kind of accidentally as an academic. So that's just a little background. When we think about race, I think that one question we might ask is, what are we talking about? Are we talking about our lives as Asian Americans? Are we talking about our lives as Caucasian folks, negotiating a world that's been racialized, that prioritizes white life over and against all other life? One thing that's interesting to me about the Black Lives Matters movement was the kind of counter movements that sprung up on the side. Blue Lives Matter, or All Lives Matter, as if the Black Lives Matter movement was a competition. I think some people thought Black Lives Matter was like, black people are better than everyone else. Black Lives Matter was the statement that at minimum black life needs to matter, because that life was continuously being squashed out. So when we think about these kind of questions, we're thinking, what do we mean by race? I think one way to think about race, and I think what I'm going to say is, I'm going to say why I think it's a permanent reality in America, the depth of that reality, maybe a metaphor through which to think about that reality. I'm going to talk about a couple things that it's going to show, or two reasons why that reality will continue through American culture and life. And then a way out that some people have been thinking about, or some people might characterize it as fantasizing about. And the character of this fantasy, you're not sure if it's a solution or a symptom of the problem. The question about Asian Americans, how we come into this, those of you guys who are Asian American, or those of us who are Christian, I hope will come up more in the discussion. I'm not going to address those things directly. So how do we think about race, or what do we think about race in America? Lately I've been thinking a lot about movies or television shows that deal with grief. Two particular shows that I think about are Manchester by the Sea. I think some of you guys have seen this. I watched it again last night after basketball. I just think this is an amazing film. And then a show Ken and I have been talking about is an HBO show called The Leftovers. And Manchester by the Sea is about a trauma some family suffers, and then the main character, Casey Affleck's ability to go on. And then The Leftovers is a show about a world just like our own, where suddenly 2% of the world's population disappears. And it's not so much a show about why it happened, like is it the rapture, or is something cosmic go on in the universe. The question is more, how do people go on after this level of trauma? It's the same question, I think, at the heart of Manchester by the Sea. And neither of the shows are very quick about offering a resolution, which is exactly why people don't tend to like those shows, right? Even though Manchester by the Sea was liked mostly by film critics, or people who wear a lot of black clothing. Same with The Leftovers, which was described simultaneously as maybe the best show ever made, or the most relentlessly depressing show ever made. I think these shows, insofar as they circle around grief and how people imagine grief, I think puts a point on how we might think about race relations in America. The reality is in American culture, and again, for those of us who are white, those of us who are Asian American, those of us who immigrated here, maybe Latino folks, we stepped into a reality that was not of our making. But make no mistake about it, we are now neck deep in that reality. And what is that reality? Well, it can be demonstrated in a number of ways historically, but probably the easiest way to talk about it is in terms of chattel slavery, the basic industrial layout that made America America. And our first thinking generally about slavery is that we're going to say something like, well, that happened like 100 years ago that ended, or 150 years ago that ended. Why can't we get over that? The question is, are there some things that we do to each other that we can never get over? Are there some types of violence or trauma, some modes of desperation, some undoing of the human soul and spirit that we just cannot get over? That to, in a sense, get over would be a demonstration of a failure of your moral depth and character. I think sometimes when we say something like, well, why can't we just get over slavery? One of two things is happening there. One, you don't understand how deep the scar of slavery is, operating something like America's original sin. And I mean that theologically, as a sin that continues to replicate itself through everything American culture is about. So you either don't understand the depth of what chattel slavery was, or what it enabled, that is the very building up of the American economy, or you don't understand how grief works. That you think something just terrible, right, 2% of the world's population disappearing one day, it's just something within a few years we should just all start moving on and getting on with our life again. And I'm guessing both of those are in play for most Americans. Most Americans want to imagine chattel slavery as something that wasn't as bad as we think. Or they want to, maybe they'll acknowledge that it was really bad, but they just approach that issue like they approach movies like Manchester by the Sea or Leftovers, which is, that's just too depressing, why can't we just move on? And I'm not going to go into the history of chattel slavery, but one thing you want to think about when you think about chattel slavery, when I mean chattel slavery is in the 300-year period where America basically built its entire economy around the forced abduction, enslavement, economic violation, animalization of a whole group and class of human beings. Remember, at some points just in terms of sheer numbers, in states there were more slaves than there were white slave owners. There were more slaves than there were white people in a lot of the economy states in the South. But it wasn't simply the South that profited off of this. The entire economy of America was built around this. So you take that reality, and by the way, one of the things that we often forget about chattel slavery was it was a system of enforced, institutionalized sexual violence. This is an often unacknowledged reality of slavery. That's the way, in the same way that you could see a strong African man as a certain kind of farmhand, there was a view towards African American women as good for certain kinds of things and other kinds of things. And we can't forget the violence of that culture, nor the fact that this was perpetuated entirely by Christianity. That almost all these people were Christians and used Christian reasons. They used Christian and biblical arguments to justify the practice. Sometimes we think about that period and we say something like, well, those people thought that African people were not humans. They thought they were animals, so they felt okay about it. That's actually not true. Most slave owners understood their slaves as human. It was what they were willing to do to themselves, right, to justify what they were doing to these fellow humans. It's easier for us to think about slavery if we think, well, they thought they were not humans. No, they fully understood they were humans. And yet we are capable of doing that to one another as humans. And so you have this entire system, but thing you want to know about the system is that this system grows up at the same time that America grows up. These are integrated realities. These are not separate and parallel realities. The Constitution of America as a people was all bent up in this. It was all caught up in this. So that means everything about America, how we understand ourselves as individuals, how we understand ourselves as communities, is all wrapped up in this reality. And so when people describe chattel slavery and its after effects, say Reconstruction, Jim Crow, earlier parts of the 20th century, where thousands of African men were being lynched. In Waco just celebrated the 100th anniversary of the lynching of Jesse Washington. There's a street in Waco named Washington Avenue. It's named after Jesse Washington, where they strung up a African-American kid and just did horrendous things to his body. And there's these amazing postcards of white men around his charred, hung body. And this was considered a souvenir, maybe somewhat similar to how Fixer Upper is a great thing about Waco right now. 100 years ago, that was a great thing about Waco, right? So you think about these subsequent periods, and these practices, this kind of habituation into this life of violence, is all wound up with whatever America is. Like the drafters of the Constitution, the makers of our laws, the people who imagined our economy, the way, say, in the 20th century we imagined housing, was all wound up in this reality. In other words, it's a cultural phenomenon, but it's also a deeply institutionalized one. Studies after studies by researchers have shown how the basic structures of our civilization is built around segregation and racism. Just this year, there's several major studies this year, but one I got to know a little bit better was a book called The Color of Law, in which it shows the entire 20th century housing economy was built to keep black people out, to empower white land ownership, to continue keeping black people out, built into a structure that year after year just added on to the institutionalization of keeping black people out of money economies. And if you know anything about the American economy, owning property is the primary ticket into wealth, or the primary expression of wealth. I think that if you look at the median income of African Americans compared to whites, I mean, it's absurd. It's something like, even if you look at the gendered reality, women, I think the average total net savings of a Caucasian woman, and remember this is significantly down from a white man, I think it's $42,000 in savings. I think it is for African American women like $400. I mean, that is an absurd difference, right? We're talking, and so when we talk about this cultural phenomenon, it's institutionalized. In other words, the entire root structure of our society is all kind of caught up in this. So, you know, and we can talk about some of this stuff and what it means for Asian Americans or, say, Latino folks to enter into it. So that's kind of some cultural metaphors to think about this as a kind of huge wound and the possibility of moving on from this kind of grief. A couple of things I want to say about why I think this will continue. In other words, I don't think this is going to get any better. Mainly because our best resources out of kind of bad practices and habits as a society is always our ability to think our way out of the present. But our thinking on issues of race is so deeply confused, so balkanized among different types of ideologies or different types of methods about thinking about the issue that we can't get out of it, right? In other words, the concepts themselves are enslaved to an enslaving culture. Let me just give you two examples. When we say race, what do we mean? We now know that race scientifically is not a thing. We know that genetically we can trace the expression of certain types of phenotypes, right? Certain kinds of hair, skin color. But there's not something called race genetically. There is something called phenotypes that you can look at someone's DNA and see its expression, have certain kinds of expressions. there isn't something called the Caucasian race or the black race. Those are cultural descriptions that we came up to kind of figure out how to get along in the world, but they're not real. So how then do we think about one another's ethnic differences? We don't want to say we're all the same, right? Because that would seem to wash out the specificity of who we are, and as Christians might say, are created to be. But on the other hand, we don't know where to locate that difference if it's not genetically or biologically. And so when we talk about race, we tend to get thrown into a bifurcation between black and white. And then sociologists will say something like race isn't real, but it's real in its effects, right? Think about the housing thing I was just talking about. Think about a study that was done by the US government a few years ago that showed that if you have an African American name and you have the exact same resume as somebody else, you have a 50% chance less of getting a call back, just because your name is like Lamar. That was the name that was used in the study. Right, so it's real in its effects, but at what other level is race real? And so one set of confusions then is that if it's not real, then how do we think about people who are not black or white, say Asians or say Latino folks? Neither of those folks fit in this strong bifurcation, and it's not quite clear where we matter. How do we talk about being Asian American? Asian Americans being, because it's not something real genetically, but it has effects. And so how do we locate ourselves in this larger story? Especially one that will, say, determine the course of our lives, even if we don't like it. Another basic confusion is what we mean by racism. The standard picture of racism is a person who has in her mind, say, a derogatory picture of a person of another race. Several of you guys applied for a job. I have a proxy exam by which I assess your ability, your qualifications for the job. But the historical reality is that some people are going to be less prepared for that kind of exam. And so my discrimination, which is colorless based on the exam, is a proxy mode of discrimination. In other words, an indirect mode of discrimination. The Supreme Court largely has ignored those modes of discrimination. And it's not like they didn't think about them. There's a really interesting legal theorist at University of Chicago named David Strauss who's looked at the history of this and says that the Supreme Court had a number of ways of thinking about racism, including a much more systemic institutional way, and it basically rejected that in favor of a kind of intentional racism, which, again, doesn't quite get at the picture of what's going on. So these are just two examples. What do we mean by race and what do we mean by racism that are going to create a situation where we just continue in our confusions. We continue down the road. So where do we go from here? There's, in the last probably 3 decades, a mode of thinking called post-racialism. And for what I can tell you, there's 3 varieties of this. And this is a fantasy people have. They think we live in a society that is dominated by notions of race. It's what people call it's racialized. How do we get out of it? And so the predominant fantasy has been called something called post-racialism. Post-racialism has 3 primary forms. The first form is probably the most insipid and silly, I would say, which is the idea that race no longer plays a role in American culture. That some people who think it does, they're just pretending, right? Say black people who complain about racial discrimination or Asian people who complain about racial discrimination, they're kind of like people who claim to see ghosts, but ghosts don't actually exist. So there's a post-racialism that says that race no longer plays a determining role. A second form, and again, that's probably the most silly version, but some people actually live with that fantasy. The second version is that as a product of immigration and intermarriage, specifically interbreeding, at some point there will no longer be races as we know them, right? Asian people will marry white folks, black folks will marry Latino folks, and after subsequent generations, there will be no more coding in the way that we currently imagine race. No one says that that's the case right now, right? This isn't like the first group, but they're hoping at some point will be like that. The third version of post-racialism is something like the recognition that the first one has not come to fruition, the recognition that the second one has not come to fruition, but the hope that even though these two have not, one day they will, and we ought to start living in a world, or we ought to start living into that picture. In other words, insofar as race is not real, we can hope for a time and begin to act like it, in which those kinds of determining factors will no longer determine the course of our lives. And from what I can tell from when churches talk about racial reconciliation, they have some version of this post-racialism in mind. Some idea of a recognition of the seriousness of our predicaments, the recognition that we're stuck, but the hope that one day will be a better society and we ought to start living in that direction. When I said in the beginning, it's not clear whether this is a genuine hope or a type of fantasy, I think what I meant by that is, well, specifically that. Is that a genuine hope that we can live that way? Or is it simply a sweeping underneath the rug of a reality that we can never escape? Maybe the only answer is to recognize these realities as a byproduct of the larger fall of sin, and to say that our life in the world, at least in America, is not going, that these realities will not end. And the best hope that we have is to live with something like grief, to acknowledge the level of suffering that we've inflicted, and to recognize it's not something we're just going to be able to get over. So the most powerful narratival expression of this is a book and later a film by Toni Morrison called Beloved, in which an African-American, a slave, escapes from slavery, heads up north, is recaptured, not wanting to go back to that life. She takes a barn saw and slits the throats of her children. And later on, one of the children's ghosts comes back and haunts her. Morrison's point was both to white and black folks, to say to white folks, this is not something we're just going to be able to get past. And to say to black folks, this is not something we're just going to be able to get past. She says that her message was equally important to both of those communities. And maybe that's the best hope we have, is to at least acknowledge our grief and remain with it. So I've said a lot, so I wanted to give you a chance to think in small groups about some responses and maybe some questions. Why don't we take like 15 minutes just with the folks right around you, and think, kind of just share, this is what I'm thinking about after he said, whatever he said, and then maybe what questions you might have. And then if someone can maybe volunteer those questions later on, that'd be great. Also, I believe there's food over there, and this is, I'm told to tell you guys this is a good time to get some food. Maybe 3 or
I didn't like experience it that much, but like a little bit.
Is that why you guys got over it?
For a lot of people, what post-racialism means is post-history. They want to be on the far side of this historical occurrence, such that the occurrence no longer determines the course of the future. That's Morrison's point in Beloved, is that there may not be that moment in American history, that there is no America without this reality. Wendell Berry also has a really powerful book called The Hidden Wound. Wendell Berry Morrison is an African-American woman. I'm sure you guys have heard of her. Wendell Berry's a Caucasian man and does farming in Kentucky. And he says that the reality for most white people is that in the same way that African-Americans are saddled with an incredible burden, that is racism and the history of racism, white people are also saddled with an incredible burden, that is trying to pretend that didn't happen. And it destroys their souls to do that, because you can't live with a lie. That fortunately we've been made as human beings to live truthfully, and to live in a lie is to be broken over that lie. And so there's a version of post-racialism that wants to be post-history, that at some point will no longer remember these things. And I think Morrison is saying that that may happen, but that won't be America. That there is no America without that reality. It's interesting that, to me, that how Asian Americans figure into the story. Because Asian Americans, especially in a place like Southern California, and especially in a place like Orange County, seem to me to often be, this is a crude description, and I hope you understand that I love Asian Americans. Some of my best friends are Asian Americans. But there is a kind of parachute mentality to Asian Americans. That is, we imagine our lives in America as settling down in a place that we can be prosperous and wealthy. And our investments into the history of that place are just necessary obstacles that we need to get to be successful, wealthy people. The Christianity is just the garnish, the spiritual garnish on that same fantasy. And so Asian Americans may imagine a place like Irvine then as a type of post-racial reality, a type of post-racial fantasy. That is, they have some level of acknowledgement of the racial powers of our society, and they hold up in some corner of it to avoid it. The primary thing they're going to try to figure out within that world is to try to figure out how to avoid the rest of this world. The phenomenon I see in this as an outsider to Irvine is the phenomenon I call queuing. That is queuing your kids up in these school systems with absurd, maybe 7 or 8 year waiting lines, like when your kid's born, you put her name in a queue so that she'll get to a certain school that will just put her in an endless cycle of getting out of these dynamics. And I think we think that if we live in certain neighborhoods empowered by certain kinds of education, supported by certain types of economic infrastructures, then we can just live in a world where this doesn't matter because there are no black people around to put this into question. So you know, those are the kinds of nefarious or kind of insipid or dangerous kinds of post-racialism. And Asian Americans, I mean, frankly, most Asian Americans don't care very much at all about issues of justice. It would take too much away from the parachute mentality to invest in local communities in that kind of way. I mean, you might think about the history of Irvine. It's an extraordinary history. From its land ownership to its current constitution, and how it imagines black life. I mean, I think about this all the time when I'm, you know, my family lives in Woodbury, and I see these Asian American women walking around with this like super dark skin outfit. It's like amazing. At first I thought they were like Muslims that were, you know, didn't want to acquiesce to the kind of body exposure that, you know, Americans have, other Americans have, but they just don't want to be dark. And I think if I'm an African American person and I'm walking down the street and I see that, how's that supposed to make me feel about myself? I mean, another reality is that, you know, South Korea has the highest rate of plastic surgery in the world, 1 in 5 South Koreans. A lot of those are eye surgeries, skin lightening surgeries. In other words, surgeries to make you look, you know, whether more white or just Asians with lighter skin. Southeast Asians like myself are, of course, in the lower pecking order. Lower on the pecking order. So let's get to the question then of kind of post-racial Christianity and what I suggested as in the third movement, maybe that's what Christian churches are about. I think that there is a dangerous version of post-racialism running through Christian churches. That's the idea of being a post-history church. That what we have in a room is a good percentage, or maybe a representative percentage of white people and Latino people and Asian people and black people, and then we get along, and we're not over-determined by our past. Say the way Korean church people have moved into inner city neighborhoods and taken all the resources in those communities and invested them only in their Korean children. That we can just get together and forget that happened. I think that's kind of what we want. And so that what I mean by post-racial is post-history is to imagine us in a room where we're not looking over our shoulder. And how do you think about this as a Christian? This is an incredibly difficult theological question because there is a part of Christianity, of course, that imagines the redeemed and resurrected Jerusalem, the new city, a city dominated by justice. But there is no account within Christianity about justice or redemption that doesn't hold in the present the past. One of the most powerful statements in Revelation is that when Christ is redeemed in his new body in the New Jerusalem, he bears the marks of crucifixion. That those continue forever. There is no celebrating the glory of the risen Christ without the memory of what we did to Christ. It may be then the case that there is no post-racial if we mean by post-history Christianity. But then this goes to the really powerful point you made earlier that it may be that as a society we're never going to get over this stuff. That our hope is going to be with Christ and the ending of this world. But within the terms of this world, the best that we're going to be able to pursue is kind of a modicum of justice. Augustine in The City of God really portrayed this well, in which he said the earthly city is just that, it's an earthly city. It can only get so far. His example was, in the criminal court systems, we have to torture some to figure out who's innocent, who's guilty. It's an amazing metaphor, because that's still what we're doing 2,000 years later in the criminal justice system. A system that works well for a lot of people by torturing some people. Is that a form of justice? Yes. It's just an incredibly limited form of justice. And it may be that in America, going to Ken's group's question, it may be that the grief we're going to live with is something that we will never get past. I think I used to be, well, you're probably hoping I at some point was, more optimistic about this. But I am increasingly less optimistic. James Baldwin, the great writer from the 20th century, a documentary about his life just recently came out. And James Baldwin saw this 60 years ago. And the fact that he could predict the situation, the conditions of our society 60 years later says that we either as a society have not gotten much further, or we've actually reverted. We've taken some steps back. Some people brought up the Trump election as indicative of some of this. It's pretty clear that a lot of people that voted for President Trump were racist people and had racist reasons. But we can never forget the depth of racism on the left. The depth of racism on the left is just a much more sophisticated version of racism. And in some sense, more dangerous. So, I mean, it's not like the Democrats have done that much for us in this regard. Yeah. What are some thoughts to that or other questions you guys had?
Yeah, one question that I had ties to what you were talking about. The idea of what do you do with this grief? I think there's more to increasing this well-meaning sadness, but like how do we like, remember the past, or how do we get uncomfortable, and how do we engage our grief in a way that is productive?
Yeah, this is a great question. So Christian grief grief is the appropriate Christian response to loss. And so then we want to ask, what is the content of grief for Christianity? And the content of grief for Christianity is a combination between mourning and hope. That there's a mode of life that's all mourning and no hope. Maybe that's what you think I'm getting at. And there's also a mode of the other side of the thing where it's all hope without any appropriate mourning. But the content of Christian grief is both of those things. The recognition that where we are now is not where we are supposed to be as creatures. And the hope that one day we will be in a better place. And notice the dynamic there. It's not simply the badness that points us to what's good. It's also the picture of the goodness that illuminates how bad things are now. Right? It's only in knowing the resurrected Christ that we get to the sense of how depraved our sin is. Now, how you hold those things is the entire question of Christian existence. My thought increasingly is that Christian life is life on a razor's edge between hope and despair. Because any serious acknowledgement of the conditions of our world will lead any serious human being to depths of despair. But without some account of hope, then we have nothing about resurrection. So I think maybe one way to answer this question is, where do we put our hope? My worry is that the dangerous modes of post-racialism is to put our hope in a world that will somehow figure out on its own, whether by accident, intermarriage, immigration, or by some kind of societal calculus, right, social engineering, that we're going to get somewhere. And I think my point about Baldwin is that 60 years later, it seems like we're doing worse. So then, that's why I was saying maybe our hope isn't going to be something like America's going to try to somehow get out of this. That there is no getting out of it. And to live as a Christian in this world is to mourn on a regular basis what America is, with the hope that our future is not America. Now let me just make a distinction there. There's versions of that are great, which is, I'm an American and I'm going to try to live in and of this world in America. But there's also a version of that that's bad. That is to say, I don't care about America. You can't get any better. Then you don't fight for justice at all. The question is, how are we going to live for justice born out of hope, but recognize the limits of that justice? I think that's what Augustine's The City of God was about. And it's not like Augustine himself figured this out. This is something he struggled with as a person involved in political life. So I just find that most Christians don't live substantively with either side of that content. Seriously with the possibility of despair and mourning, or seriously with hope that strives towards something like justice. Because it's too hard. So it's just frankly easier to hole up in a place and figure out how to avoid certain depravities, or even worse, to try to figure out how to get rich off of that, which is what a lot of people do. They just either don't know they're doing that, or they do and they have bad souls.
I just want to share a quote from St. Augustine about hope. It reminded what you were talking about between living within lament and hope. He says that hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain as they are. So I think as we talk about what it means to grow and be okay with the anger that we have, regarding the situations that we are, the state that we're in. Yeah, and just that, that like, I just want to like reiterate that like we can be hopeful and have courage in the things that we do to better our state. I know that it seems really discouraging all the time, and that we may not get so far, but I think that being in the conversation and being here and being aware of our own identities, I think is a step towards living into that hope. And I think, yeah, just that's as an encouragement from years ago that St. Augustine wrote. So.
What do you guys think about the role, I'm just going to ask this because there are a lot of Asian folks in the room. What do you guys think about the role Asian Americans play in all of this? And some of the immigration laws enacted against Asian Americans. I actually had a dream about this last night. I think I was talking to you guys, and I was talking about what that was like to come to America as Chinese, say, and this is just a Chinese immigrant story, but to come to America as Chinese immigrants at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, and to build the literal pathway, the railroad that connected the continent. It wasn't obviously easy work. And to play such a pivotal role in a society, and then to have laws enacted that you would not ever be able to live in America with your wife that you left behind in China. To have laws enacted in ways that disable any ability to own property, which is to have any type of stability of your own. To be a fifth-generation Japanese American who wants to fight for your country, America, and be suspected that you must be a spy for Japan because the color of your skin. So these are not histories most of us know. And even if we do know them, there's a fantasy of living past this. The two books I would really recommend to you guys is Tan Viet Nguyen's book, what's the name of the book again? The Sympathizer, which is probably, in my mind, the most insightful book on Asian American life I've ever read, fiction or nonfiction. He's a literature professor at USC. That book won the Pulitzer. He also published another book about the Vietnam War that was up for the American Book Award. I think it's probably the first time in history that a person in the same 12-month period had a Pulitzer nonfiction book and a National Book Award nominee for nonfiction. An extraordinary kind of reflection on what it means to be Asian American. This is a really powerful book. And the other one, of course, is Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, about Black life in kind of late capitalist culture, and the true fear and dauntingness of that reality. So I think those are two books that can give you some insight into some of those realities. Other thoughts or questions?
It seems to me like in the article that you wrote about moral ambiguity, like it seems for many of us Asian Americans, our ability to succeed or do well economically or whatever depends on our ability to not disrupt things and just stay in line, be industrious. And I feel like that's how we've learned to navigate our place. And I guess then I don't necessarily have a question. If I do, it would be do you think then it falls on Asian Americans, Christians? Are we perhaps called to disrupt that narrative somehow? I don't know how, but like, is that what witness might look like?
I personally take that as a calling. I want to disrupt that narrative in my own life. In all kinds of unhelpful ways, I'm sure. Amanda was, we're talking over here about white guilt, and how usually in these conversations, white people just sit around feeling guilty about being white. And I think that's a path that white people need to traverse, but hopefully that's not the end of the conversation. I asked, do Asian people ever feel guilty for the kind of commodities that they get for being Asian American? The suggestion that insofar as you're an Asian applicant to a law firm, that you're probably going to do well by the law firm simultaneously by being a hard worker, and two, not upsetting the apple cart. And what that, recognizing the benefit you get and the cost that other people have to pay for that benefit. I think the article I sent you guys was to say that this is, to me, an undeniable fact about Asian Americans, that we benefit off of this racist system. It's also an undeniable fact that the racism kills us. And being Asian American, this is what I was trying to say in the article, is about living with both of these realities. I think we would like to pretend that there's no commodities, just like we would like to pretend that there were no consequences or costs for us or for others. I think where Asian Americans may begin to work on this stuff is in pursuits of justice, both for their own communities, but also for other communities. And that's the opposite of the queuing mentality. You can imagine the queuing mentality is a rival to Christianity. The problem is there's a lot of Christians involved in those queues. But the queuing mentality is I'm going to protect my own. Asian Americans might imagine their own as much bigger than that. And that their posture to the world isn't a defensiveness, but the imagining of our life is now part and parcel with other people who suffer. The relationship between mourning and hope is to, in a sense, commit our cause to the cause of other people who suffer. And that's kind of what I meant by the parachute mentality, is that we don't naturally incline in that direction. Probably because we're an immigrant people and we come from suffering, or we have narratives of suffering that we're trying to get out of. So we're not trying to adopt more suffering when we get here. But my hope is that in the second, third, fourth generation of Asian Americans is that we will both learn from those narratives and to contain those narratives of suffering in a way that will allow us to enter, in a sense, immigrate into the histories of sufferings of other people. And that would be the ultimate way of upsetting the apple cart, not simply for our own lives, but for the whole societal structure that wants to continuously replicate the same old structures. Civil Rights Act of 1964, which not only allowed African Americans to participate in things like elections, but that forced the hand of the nation to think, well, we're extending rights to African Americans, it doesn't make sense to continue to have immigration laws against Asian Americans. Now, very few Asian Americans were involved in the fight for civil rights, but we are massive beneficiaries of that. And so again, we can either ignore that or figure out how to step into it. So going to the practical question, I think when we think about things like race, the biggest picture for us in the fight for justice is going to be something like, that looks something like protest, right? Some new version of the civil rights movement. And the response of, say, Black Lives Matter, I think is one expression of that. And then the big criticism of Asian Americans is that Asian Americans, you don't see any Asian Americans in that fight, or you see them rarely. And so with the kind of ergo, get involved more with that. I certainly think that that is one place Asians need to participate and be visible, especially when you have all the momentums to avoid that reality. So So you need to make conscious decisions to enter into those struggles. And remember, these struggles are both in Irvine, but right up the street in Santa Ana. There's a big incident just recently in Santa Ana that many of you may know about. So you can jump into that. But I think it would be a mistake to say that that's the only way we enact justice. Those of you guys that are involved in urban communities, by the way, I mean, as an example, may not be protesting, but there are ways in which your lives with Black lives is an expression that they matter, right? And say the tutoring of Black communities or neighborhoods or Latino communities for these systemic modes of injustice. So there are multiple ways we can engage and enter into these realities, but we will first need to make an intentional decision that we're not going to live the cubed life. If you can pull yourself out of the cubed life, remember, the cubed life is years in the making. If you can pull yourself out of that, which is a tall order in itself, then you can begin to imagine other modes of existence in our world. Most people are not going to be able to do that. The fact that you guys are having this conversation, right, says that you guys want to be out of that. So then the question becomes, what modes of activism, what modes of fighting for justice is going to characterize your life? Again, for some of you guys, it will be the kind of protest work. You'll take your particular degrees or your particular passions and gifts and figure out how to engage in modes of thinking through these, say, economic systems or political systems. Others of you, you don't have those skills, or maybe you don't have those propensities, and there are other ways that you will need to jump in. It doesn't all need to look like protests, even though sometimes we're told that we all need to look like protesters. There are other ways to kind of think through this. An example of this is in the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, the majority of the attention was given to the protesters. But interestingly, and this is going to live into a certain stereotype of Asian Americans, but I think it's an interesting one. A lot of the Black Lives Matters movement, of course, is enabled by social media. And it was interesting, a lot of Asian American engineers enabled and thought through and created these infrastructures. And they were interviewed when they talked about this. I think some of the stuff took place in San Francisco. And they interviewed some of these folks, and they said something to the effect of, well, most people wouldn't see us as involved with Black Lives Matters because they don't see us on the television. But we were involved in creating the networks that brought people into these types of engagements. Or if you live, Hamilton was saying that, you know, growing up in Southern California, specific parts of Southern California, he was in a sense cued in a certain direction. And it was only later on when he started working with certain populations that he became aware of the dynamics of a different population and how his life benefited, in a sense, off the cost that this other population paid. So those types of availing yourself to the world is an expression of how hope and despair go hand in hand. Because living with those communities, you're surely going to come to terms with the despair. It's going to force the hand of hope. But hope is also going to avail just how bad things are, and the ability to hold these things together, like the Augustine quote, is the whole content of Christianity. So.
Yeah, I would say that one thing practically that, you know, the community in Irvine can consider is that, you know, I mean, I personally chose to move to LA, but one of the big needs right now is that we feel in our community is the increased activity of Homeland Security and ICE in deporting our neighbors. And the parents of the kids in our youth group are having serious discussions with the relocators and saying, if I get deported back to my home country, can you take care of my kids? Can you house them? And until, you know, I get over back to Mexico or Guatemala and figure stuff out, and can you help, you know, bring my kids back over and we can be reunited. But I think, you know, one of the things that we have in abundance in Irvine are resources, particularly housing. You know, I don't know how this kind of organizing might look like, but it would be, you know, it would be cool to see, right? Like people with extra rooms in Irvine or wherever be able to be opening themselves up to shelter, right, immigrant families who may be under, that kind of pressure. So not necessarily you yourself relocating, but opening up your homes and your lives to receiving people from these communities.
I will say that one thing though is encouraging to me, and I actually qualify this by saying I don't put a lot of stock in things like, I think voting is important and participation in democracy is important, but I don't say this to say that I thought Hillary was going to do so much more for America. I don't think she was. I think we're going to get the same kind of thing. But Asian Americans did historically vote very well against Trump, even against their own benefit, right? Because Asian Americans some Asian Americans in higher tax brackets would have benefited from some economic policies. But I think among the aggregate groups, Asian Americans tend to have the highest percentage of voting against Trump, often along the lines of justice or what they take to be important social issues. So that was pretty encouraging. You're probably well aware that I blew up something in your church and we had a conversation about meat eating some years ago. I still blame Janet for that.
It's Janet.
What our parents have, and something that we rarely enter into, which is its own issue of dishonoring our parents, is they have the immigrant story, which is a story about hope and despair. That is, they have traveled, in some cases, literally the same road as many ethnic minority groups in this country in terms of making their home in a strange land and suffering all the indignities and injustices along the way. It's just what they do with that story that can become problematic, right? There's two parts of the problematic version of that story. One is a disassociation of that story from other parallel stories to say, this is why we're better than people who complain or what have you, right? And so that version of the holding of the story, or simply a forgetting of the story altogether. But the main goal of my coming to America was that, my son could go to Berkeley and then UCLA Law School and then work for a really great law firm, without remembering the connection between that immigrant experience and the way it informed that dream. I think if we can tap into that story, then there is a place to do work. But most of us haven't even done enough of the work in terms of knowing our parents' story and then coming alongside and understanding that story. But this is, to me, one of the great hopes of the immigrant church. Because the immigrant church is a church that remembers, at the core of what Christians are is we are immigrants. We are perpetual immigrants. The great danger of immigration is to think that you finally have found a home that now you can settle into. And that you're supposed to make that home all pretty and cue yourself up and protect yourself from the rest of the world. What Christians believe is that this is not our home. We are perpetually immigrant people. This is the ultimate logic of Augustine, the city of God. That we are a permanent immigrant people. And if we can retain that story that we received from our parents, then it can be the ethos that both combines us with their story, but it can also be an engine that moves us forward in this world, that we constantly remind ourselves that the goal was never to live in Irvine. The goal is to live with Christ. This is one stop. No more better or problematic than any other stop along the way. This is what our parents have to teach us. If we have, the courage to step into that story with them, and they have the courage to share it with us, which just often isn't the case. That's what I would say. I think our parents are a tremendous source of hope for us. The drama of the second and third generation Christian Asian American communities is how do we maintain life with folks who imagine the world so vastly different than we do, who may imagine that the cued life is the end of the immigrant life, and have really good, this is what I think Confucianism to mean, good reasons for that. And the difficulty of that not being a philosophical discussion, but a deeply personal one. So, yeah, it's a great point.
My question playing off of that then is we talked about the KeyLight. How much would you say is it imperative for us to understand or know that narrative as a catalyst to move out of that?
Say what? I think I just want to make sure I understand the question.
Right. Like if these narratives are sort of cut off from the second, third generation, right? And there isn't that rich resource of tapping into that dynamic of despair and hope, right? Like, how much of that is a factor of
Intentionally living differently.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, the Q, right, so the way the Q works in Irvine schools is you identify some middle school with super high test scores, and everyone else happens to figure that out at the same time, because it's posted on Facebook. Everyone makes a beeline for that school, and now there's a 7-year waiting list. And the problem with the Q is it just grows itself, right? What started as a 6-month waiting list, 2 years, now 7 years. You have to be as intentional to, well, more so intentional to live differently. So the example Carrie and I would offer is, so when we moved to Waco, you know, being a professor, they probably just assumed I was going to live with other wealthy white people. And so the real estate agent took us to wealthy white part of Waco. You don't get to see this part, fixer upper, sorry. And it was, you know, it's a great neighborhood. It was like wannabe Irvine in Waco, which is very far from Irvine. But wannabe Irvine in Waco, you know, master plan community and this kind of thing. But it was just, what I realized after a while is that I was cueing my kids in a certain kind of way, because I drive them to the school, and everyone that drove, you know, there's Cadillac Escalades and Mercedes, and I mean, the school that our kids were going to was like private school resources funded by public school money. Literally 2 miles away were schools that were deeply impoverished and would probably never get out of these cycles, right? And so we just had to ask ourselves, we've already put ourselves in a queue. And do we want our kids to not have access to these stories that portray the world in a different way? And we decided we needed to do something. And so we took our kids and moved them to an inner city school. It's a charter school in Waco. Because we wanted them to know that they were not being raised to be wealthy white kids. And we knew we had made the right decision, because the first time we took our daughter to the charter school, her first response was, "This school is too small, I don't want to go here." In other words, the queuing had already taken its effect. Fortunately, now that how long they've been in the school now, 6 years or something? Now they just think the world is constituted by a lot of African American and Latino American kids, because it is. And they don't know any better, and we're really grateful for that. Is the school lacking in resources in all kinds of ways? Absolutely. That's our world. So you have to you absolutely have to be intentional. Otherwise, the queuing it's a social phenomenon, right? So I think it's a great question. The other thing I want to say about this is that we will only do these things well if we do these things as a community. That's what you guys have. The gift of this church cannot be underestimated. It's the same thing with adoption, right? Adoptions tend to happen in masses. Because if you live in a community where you talk about adoption in a non-idiotic way, where people don't ask questions like, what, are you going to have your own kids? Then other people, so that's what they show, that churches that have a lot of adoptions, they have even more adoptions. It's the same thing, if you live in a community where the expectation is against the queue, right? You're not going to see that Facebook page that says, get in the queue for this middle school. You're going to have a different type of queue. And that's what the great gift of this community is. And something that, in talking to Ken and Janet over the years about this church, or the idea of this church when it didn't exist, was to, in a sense, create a very different type of moral formation. And to be with enough like-mindedness where people encourage each other to live different kinds of ways. So And insofar as you guys are asking the questions you're asking, you guys have, it's a real gift. You guys probably don't recognize how much of a gift it is because you're here. But, just take yourself or imagine yourself other kinds of churches that could be imagining the world very differently. And that's also a great way to think about inviting people to this church. It's to say that when they come to this church, they're going to get a different Christianity, which is the greatest gift we give people, is to give them alternatives to the way that they would live, if not for the expression of something different.
Last question, John. Is it possible to not live the cute life in Irvine? Mainly like in terms of your and Carrie's story, you moved out. Which begs the question then, for those of us who live in Irvine, is there any hope for us to live differently in a city that is created with cute culture, cute.
My sister, before she lived in Woodbury, she used to live in North Park, which I thought was the ultimate redundancy because they had a gated community. And it was like the person that worked at the security was so easy to talk into letting you in there. It was completely, it was all for show, the gated community, because the entire world of Irvine is a gated community. If you look at how civil engineers develop freeway systems, they are meant to explicitly avoid certain kinds of neighborhoods and funnel wealthy people into certain other kinds of neighborhoods. Just think about the way you guys have multiple toll roads in this area, and what that is supposed to express about the rest of Southern California. So in some sense, living here is the cute life. But you could say this about America, right? I mean, you may, if you say that there's no hope for Irvine, then you might as well say there's no hope for America, which I think there's plenty of reason to think that, except for we are people of hope, and we believe God is bigger than the consequences of sin. It just means that we're going to have to hold those things together, to believe that only in the midst of sin are we going to see God, and the seeing of God illumines how sinful and broken we are. So there's ways to live in Irvine. I think you guys are doing it well, a lot of you guys, but it is very, very hard. It's much easier for me and Carrie for our kids to live in certain communities, or for our kids to go to a certain school, because there's a lot of things we don't have to think about. We don't have to be intentional about them hanging around African American kids because there's African American kids there. And so in some ways, putting yourself in a certain type of structure enables this more so. But there's no doubt that you need to be intentional no matter what. Like we've noticed our son, David, is already starting to hang around with all the other smart kids in the charter school who happen accidentally to be all white. So it's like the same issue of intentionality continuously replicates itself. I mean, you might just think about that as the insistence of the devil, just how dogged evil is. But that just requires us to be more dogged. And insofar as we have hope that good will outpace evil any day of the week, then we have cause to believe that, we're on the right path.
Well, it's 9:30. I think we should close. I'm going to give John a hand.